We got Zoom bumped for 5 seconds. I'll delete that. But we got some undecideds. Exactly, Kyle. I'm just gonna go over the Fishbowl rules. The way it works is there will be 2 to 4 people in the middle, and that means they have their microphones on. Everyone else should have their microphones off. To join the middle, all you have to do is put it in the chat that you're tapping in, and I will put you in stack. I'll let you know when you can turn on your mic. To tap out, all you have to say is, okay, I'm done, I'm tapping out, and then you can mute yourself. And then that's it. People will come in and out of the Fishbowl with questions and answers, and it's a participatory way to have a conversation, but on Zoom, where it's difficult for many people to talk at the same time. Are there any questions about the format? Awesome. All right, so we just need 2 volunteers to show what it's like to start off the Fishbowl. And the question will be right after Patricia introduces herself. The first questions will be, what is the state? Just so we all know what we're talking about. Or what do you think the state is? And do we need it? But first, let's have Patricia introduce herself if you can. Your name, pronouns, and what brought you here today.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'll turn my camera on in a few minutes. My name is Patricia or Patty or Patti, and I use she, her pronouns. And what brought me here is that every single one of these events that I've been to, I've really learned a lot from. And so I just wanted to come and learn from each one of you and hear what you'll have to think about this topic. Yay. About the state, because I don't think we need it, but we might need it for some things. So we'll see.
Thank you, Patricia. All right, so, okay, who wants to start off? What is the state? And I will spotlight you, that means so that people know to look at you while you're talking. I'm gonna spotlight Sean, and we need another person to join Sean. Anyone? Oh, Emily, awesome. And I think I saw Blake. All right, we have 3 people. And you can all be unmuted and just start answering and asking questions of each other.
Sean, you go first. You were the first one in the middle.
Well, I mean, my stance. So, I think the state is both a historical thing, but also a sort of social psychological thing. I think I think any conversation about the state needs to be clear about which dimension you're looking at, right? Are you looking at it as some social psychological structure that exists whenever you have a certain number of humans that are interacting, right? Which is one way of looking at the state. And the other one is, oh, well, there's this history and blah, 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 and these different formations, and we can trace what happened here and whatever, different formations and stuff like that. So I think it's important to be clear about, so like, what is the, so the state is so I'll just to make it to not be too whatever. I think the state is a structure that gets created whenever you have a sufficiently complicated society. Whenever you have enough people who don't know each other, who aren't first cousins, right? There's structures that get institutionalized, and it's whatever you call it, it's the state.
I like that. I like that idea of like, there's an implied cooperation with people that you don't personally know. That I really like that part of your definition there. I looked it up in advance of this meeting because I was thinking kind of the same thing. And there's 2 definitions here that both leave the same question in my mind. A, an organized political community under one government, a commonwealth, a nation. B, such a community forming part of a federal republic as in the United States of America. And okay, that's cool. But the second half of both of those definitions makes me question if it's really necessary to the meaning of state. Do we need to be under a government? Do we need to be part of a federal republic to be an organized political community that is effectively a horizontal state? Is that something that's possible?
I'll follow up on that. We've had some good discussions in like the CDP WhatsApp threads about anarchism versus statism, and I think we're getting some echo from you, Emily, potentially. And I'd agree with Sean's definition, especially anything beyond, a certain level of like hunter-gatherer level of sophistication. You need some organized purpose around a common goal. That is a state to me. That's it's a tool. And I actually came across this the Wagnerian definition of state recently. He was some German economist who I came across like last week. Wasn't even doing research for this. It just popped across my Twitter feed. And I was like, yes. And it really reinforced for me the idea that a state is a tool and it's only going to be used for whatever we decide it to be.
So do I just speak up if I have something to say? I think that's the rules here, right? Okay. So yeah, I think one thing I've been thinking about a lot is just like that most of my life I've sort of thought of state and government as the same thing. And I don't think they actually are the same thing when we're approaching it from like a liberatory kind of framework. And in particular, as long as we live in a society where a certain class or classes dominate other classes, then I think it is the role generally of the state to basically reinforce that class structure. And that is done, I mean, this is maybe the long-winded explanation, but like that is done through a system of institutions and cultural norms and things like that. As Sean mentioned, it is both like institutional and interpersonal. So I would lump even things like church or school in with the, the concept of state, if we look at it in that lens. The simple definition maybe that I've heard, I forget exactly who I heard this from, but it's like basically anything that has a military as a state, which is interesting too when we start to think about things like private militias and things. And like in capitalist society, the state isn't just the government, if we use that definition. But I'll cut myself off there.
I just want to say this is a great format. Everything that I've heard so far is really cool and really interesting. A helpful definition that I think both Blake and Eric were gesturing towards is the one that's proposed by Max Weber, in the early 20th century, that the state is the institutional entity that has a monopoly on violence. Oftentimes it's coercive violence, but in generally violence. In other words, the state is a thing that supersedes all other violent entities within a society. And for that reason, the state often is seen as the thing that has sovereign power. In other words, supreme lawmaking power. So one way that you can kind of take this limited definition that focuses on violence from Weber is to actually think about it in terms of, well, who has the power of law, who makes the law, who has a legitimate claim on law, and how is that law then devised and enforced, and who does it and against whom. And from that perspective, we can think a lot about things that have state or state-like power. As I think someone in the comments mentioned, schools, for example, have state-like power in the context of education and students. They have supreme law-making power, and for the most part, they have coercive violence. There are other ways that you can think about it in terms of the city. The city has state-like powers. The state of California does, the federal government does too. So
One
anyways, I
problem
think
with,
that's
oh,
interesting.
sorry, no.
I also wanted to note, Sean, that I really appreciate the distinction that you made. I think that's something that worth dwelling on. The state as like historical development as a social political configuration, but then also the state as like an ideal. I think that's an important distinction here. So I just want to like add one last thing here that I think is worth thinking about is when I heard the question of do we need the state, I also hear the question of, well, what kind of state? Because it might not be a binary yes or no. It might be that there are certain aspects of the state that are things that we want and certain aspects of the state that we don't want. And it just so happens that all these things are now the state because of historical circumstance. But it's not necessarily true that a state has to be the police plus lawmaking plus educational systems plus
Yeah.
military. Like I mean, these things don't necessarily have to go together. And historically and comparatively, they haven't. We are living in a kind of unique historical constellation of things. So a question I would just propose is, if we're not going to look at this particular configuration of the state as being fixed, what constellation of things, institutions, and relationships do we want as a society? And I'd love to hear all of your thoughts on that.
Let me respond real quick. I think, Sean, you wanted to say something, but just before I tap out, I was going to answer the original prompt that I believe very strongly, yes, we need a state. We don't necessarily need the state. I think humanity has too many problems that are very deep and intractable and require some sort of enforcement, whether it's housing, transportation, climate, so many different things that unfortunately do require a bit of hierarchical power. That's something that I believe, and I'd like to hear other people's discussions as well as I tap out.
I'll make one more comment before tapping out as well, and that's that I think I'm not an expert on Weber, but I think that a lot of conversations about violence, on the political conversations about violence, historically focus on sort of like physical violence of the gun, right? But ignore institutional violence, right? Ignore social violence, right? Right? The way kids on a schoolyard can bully each other is a form of violence, right? The way someone can be excluded from having their basic needs met, right? There's all kinds of things. And so if we understand violence as broader, then we don't fall into the libertarian trap, right? Of focusing on who has badges and guns. And we start understanding violence as various forms of domination and dehumanization. And then we have the tools to fight it much more broadly than I need my guns versus the government's guns, which is very cartoon versions of violence. But I'll step out now.
Yeah, I want to.
Here, Sean. Sorry, Nick, go ahead.
Actually, go ahead. I'm realizing I need to organize what I'm thinking.
I would like to tap out, but before that, I'd just like to say here to what Sean has to say. I think we need to consider all sorts of different forms of violence, and I think actually, in some ways, a better word, which Sean said, is domination. I think you can better define domination as a critical component of state or stateness in an institution. Is there domination? And what that means is that we can expand what is the state to even interpersonal dominations and not just institutional dominations too. The other thing I'd like to note is that the topic of complexity came up a little earlier in the conversation. Recent anthropological work by folks like David Wengrow or David Graeber has actually shown that complex societies have and indeed existed without any sort of state-like coercive mechanisms and institutions. So I just want to throw out there that we may want to separate the idea of complexity from the idea that we need hierarchy and coercion, because I think there's plenty of historical evidence, at least anthropological evidence and speculative or inferential evidence, that those two things might not necessarily have to be connected. And with that, I'd like to tap out.
Sarang, that was great. You actually said a bunch of what I had tapped in to say, so thank you for taking care of that. And my question specifically was around the juxtaposition of massive scale cooperation and solving problems that are global, like climate change, and the necessity of hierarchies of power and domination and authority. Like, are they intractable, or can you have the first without the latter? My additional question, based on what you just added, I definitely, I think it's very cool. There's definitely evidence that human societies have thrived without a state for long periods of time. On what kind of global scale? I guess what I'm saying is, how do we solve climate change in a horizontal, non-dominating structure or way of collaborating? And I want to hear what anybody thinks to that.
Well, I think you could argue that the only way that we solve climate change is through a horizontal, non-dominating structure that are the very domination of the Earth, that is part of like the fossil economy, is not separate from our domination of each other. And I actually don't know if I hold that position, but I'm gonna represent it here. But I also think that, in terms of thinking about whether we need the state, there's a big difference for me between thinking about a transitional strategy versus like a utopian society. I think, a lot of anarchists are means ends people who think that those things actually shouldn't be different, transitional strategy and utopian society. But it's hard for me to imagine, we don't have to like play a thought experiment, right? Like, we have a ticking clock, we have like climate change happening. And I think that's why we keep bringing it up. And it's hard to imagine not like, using coercive authority over like Nazis who are still going to be around in 10, 20 years, as we like move society forward, as like a transitional strategy. And then I'm jumping all over the place here because I've been listening to a lot of interesting things, but I agree that there's a difference between hierarchy and organization, that I think you were talking about, Emily. And I think, to your point, Sean, about slow violence, I actually think there's less of a distinction here than people make of it sometimes. I think slow violence is always ultimately backed up by real violence. It's like a learned violence maybe, but like, the reason that hunger happens as a slow violence is because people know, if I go to the grocery store and steal bread, I'm going to be subject to like actual violence. And like a society that operates on a principle of like, people should just be able to take what they need for sustenance, like wouldn't have those kinds of slow violence activities.
I would like to hear what people think about like a little bit of like a collaboration. What do you think? I mean, this is what CDP is all about, is community orientation and figuring out together, how do we create these structures that we need? How do we solve these huge intractable issues if there is no state? For me, like, it's almost impossible to imagine, getting Medicare for all. How do we administrate such an enormous, amazing thing that is necessary? Like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, a bunch of huge organizations, formed this group 3 years ago saying, all right, we're going to fix healthcare in America. They just disbanded like 2 weeks ago because like, oh, it's how can we do? No, this is a problem for something bigger than us, which is, to me, is just another thing of like, the state is absolutely necessary. It's a tool, and how we use it, creating that state together is the most important thing to me.
I think an example of like a complex organization that's run non-hierarchically, even within a profit-driven economy, is the Gore Corporation. It's actually like it's like a very complicated science-driven factory operation, industrial factory operation, and they're run without internal hierarchies, except there is like an owner who does like own it. But beyond that, there's like, it's very loose, it's self-organized.
Do you know how large they are? How many employees?
At least several thousand. They have many factories, and it's the company that makes Gore-Tex. Sorry, I should have clarified that immediately. And other like kind of complex materials science things. But they limit their factory sizes to like 250, I think, as like a sort of rule of how many people can function as a group together. But the organization as a whole still functions.
Jonathan, you just joined in. Did you have anything to say? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in about the healthcare thing that the Zapatistas in Chiapas in Mexico actually administer what is in the region considered to be the best healthcare, like better than the Mexican state provides. And what was said also about the Gore company that manufactures Gore-Tex is also a good example as well. Basically using natural and examples from nature and from evolution of autonomous organization, sort of like schooling fish or migrating birds that just sort of on the basis of very simple rules are able to organize themselves and work towards a collective good. Like migrating birds, for instance, switch off who is at the lead of the V between them periodically, so that nobody is taking more of the brunt of the headwind than anybody else. And the way that they do that at Gore also is a good example of that. That's that number that you mentioned, which is like 150-ish, is actually a fairly well validated anthropological number. It has a name attached to it. I don't remember what the name is, but the idea is
you can only
have
150 friends, right? Something like that.
Exactly, that's the idea. That like the human brain has an upper limit of how many people it can like directly interface with, and it's not just them. It's also that was based on like anthropological studies of like Papua New Guinea and other like Neolithic tribes that generally tend to adhere to that maximum number, and once they get larger than that, they split off. And the idea, I think, basically is that when you're below that number, you don't need nearly as many abstract rules and regulations to govern interacting with people, because you know everybody personally. And so it's much easier to organize things because you don't have to worry about nearly as much about bad actors and things like that, because you know everyone again. So I would say that in terms of the specific question that's being asked with healthcare, yeah, the EZLN are a pretty good example of that. And they have fairly, advanced stuff as well. Like they have ultrasounds, for instance, and a couple of other places as well that, I mean, I don't know, it's obviously not without a state, but other places with healthcare as well that have managed to do it very cheaply, like Japan. They focus, heavily on the kind of stuff that you guys are all about, like on community, community-based, involvement, and a lot of the other stuff that influences health, like the environment, access to nutritious food, access to good, exercise, things like that.
I separated my shoulder when I was living in Japan, and I got firsthand experience with the Japanese healthcare society. And let me tell you, it blew the American healthcare experience out of the water.
Yeah, I think that like the basic orientation of CDP is in the right direction, because if you look over and over at places that have good, strong social, networks, places like Japan, like Finland, like Iceland, over and over again, you see that the place that they're starting out from is collectivist rather than individualist. They are starting from the perspective of how do we get the most benefit to the most people with, the fewest resources. And I think that just starting out from that perspective alone makes an enormous difference. I mean, compared to like, I'm a medical student myself, and like working in transplant wards, I would be thinking, for every for every, you know, transplant that we do here that gives like a couple extra years to somebody, that's millions of dollars. You could save 10, 20 lives with that much healthcare. And not that I, you know, don't want to give these other people, you know, their healthcare as well, but at the same time, it's like I would rather give somebody, you know, a life from 35 to 65 than from, you know, 68 to 70. And in the health, and the thing is too, in the States, and with the way that we look at healthcare, it's very much often not even to the benefit of the patient. Like you look at a lot of the healthcare that we spent in the United States is in the last year or 6 months of somebody's life, and very often it's futile or nigh futile care, where frankly the patient would be better off and their family would be better off if they were sent to hospice and allowed to die in
On that,
peace, not in pain. And I'll
can I
yield
say
in that.
exactly that sort of thing is what I'll say before I tap out as well, is like, we live in a physical world. There's the laws of physics and reality that we have to deal with. It's the way that we approach it and what tools and the way we organize ourselves is how we solve it. We hit those hard limits, our bodies failing, you know, the human condition. There will always be murderers. There will always be racists. How do we build our structure in society to keep that to a minimum? To me, the state is necessary to that. And I'll tap out.
Yeah, I want to respond on that 150 person kind of limit. And like, I think it's like important not to idealize smaller scale social formations. It's also important not to idealize countries like Japan or Sweden, who actually are still heavily involved in exploiting the global south to enrich themselves, and like they're able to have these really strong welfare systems in part because they are doing this exploitation that is sort of like mystified through commodity exchange and basically the capitalist economy. But going back to the smaller scale societies thing, I think there is still a threat of violence in that case, except in this particular instance, like I think that the consistent way that smaller societies, I mean, this is just going off of like some ethnographic stuff that I've read, is, you know, the biggest threat is always the threat of like being ostracized from society. Like they're not going to like put you in prison, but they're going to cut you off. They're going to kick you out of the group, which like in a, you know, a million years ago is basically the same thing as a death sentence. So like there's always some kind of threat of being cut off. I think what makes our society different is that we can't do that because there's always like a way for people to to survive in an alienated and isolated way, you know, by moving to a new city, getting a new job, whatever it might be. You don't need to have interpersonal, like long-term interpersonal relationships to survive in a capitalist society. And so, I mean, that is an argument in favor of a state of some kind, I think. But it's very specific to the historical moment that we're in. And like, I think there is, there's value in separating out. And I know like separating means and ends is always dangerous, but there is some, we need to think about it in a way where we're also acknowledging the moment we're in addition to where we want to get to, I think. Yeah, I'll stop there.
So I'm really enjoying hearing what everyone has to say. So I'll tap out after this, but I wanted to pose two sort of thoughts and questions that I would love to hear more on if possible. First is this general question of whether there are things that we have in our current society that we can have without a state. I think the answer is always going to be no, because much of what we have, our culture, our society, our institutions, are conditioned and structured by the state itself. So not having the state, well, we're not going to have a lot of the things that we've grown familiar with. And I think that's just a sort of aspect of the predicate nature of the state. So if you're thinking about like, well, how do we have Medicare for all, or how do we have this or that without the state? What we're really maybe looking at is, well, if we had abolished a state, or if we have a different state, what sort of, how would that change us as people? How would that change how we relate to each other as a society? And inevitably, it's going to be different, perhaps drastically different than what we have today. The second thought I would be curious about is whether the state has a role in actually promoting democracy and promoting small scale, formations or promoting social institutions. We tend to think of democracy's role with the state as being that democracy comes first, and then the state is a thing that's created by democratic will and democratic sovereignty. But does the state have a role in, say, promoting democracy itself, even when that democracy does not necessarily intersect with the state's activities? In other words, to put it on a kind of more concrete scale, is there a role of the state, for example, in funding and promoting the Community Democracy Project? Is there a role for the state to actually actively empower local councils to make decisions for themselves? So that's something I'd like to wonder. I'd like to ask about too. Is this a question of a state or no state, or could this be a question of is there a place for the state to actually empower democracy from the ground up? And with that, I'd like to tap out.
Yeah, I like the way Sarang raised sort of the questions, and also in the earlier round around like maybe the question is more like what are the structures we need as opposed to yes or no state, or what are the aspects, what are the things handled by what we call the state today, that et cetera. And so my mind is going in multiple ways from that, but one is sort of like, I think if you think about the word state, it's related to static, right? Fixed. And I'm thinking about dogmatism, religious dogmatism, for example, and various other forms of oppressive consciousness. And so like what happens is, and so maybe the question isn't, or maybe it's like, it's less about, or maybe it's about like, do we have social structures that are participatory, that are formed and co-created by us? Or do we have social structures and institutions that we interpret as fixed? I have to do this because my grandparents before me did the same thing. I have to follow this religion because that's the only choice I have in my small community where everyone goes to the same church, whatever it may be, right? And so if we broaden our question to more like, to what extent is society co-created by its participants? And or to what extent is it just something that is received as whole cloth, without and unquestioned, static, like the state, right? Fixed, right? Then the question of how liberation should happen, right, is more clear, right? So at every level, it's the same, right? Participatory structure, so that people are not fixed, they're not stuck, right? And they're not giving their power away because they think the only way to whatever solve this problem is to let whatever, so and that's why for me the power of CDP, one of the powers of CDP is taking that question of do we need the state and turning around and saying we create our circumstances, so we will answer that question by our actions, right? And so to the extent that we decide public priorities, we decide how our communities look, we decide where we channel resources, then that question of do we need the state or not falls away because we become the co-creators of social reality. It doesn't matter what you want to call it at every level, from the community to the city to the whatever, bioregion, whatever.
Yeah, I like that, Sean, and it connects a little bit to some stuff I've been learning about like certain psychoanalysis theory, and like Lacan in particular has this concept of the symbolic order. And so like a good example of the symbolic order is like somebody's like, hey man, how you doing? And you're like, oh, not bad, how about you? And like neither of you is really asking each other like, how are you doing most of the time, right? And so there's like an accepted answer. And if you just choose to answer that question however you want, people are gonna maybe have a negative or unpleasant reaction to you. It'll make them feel uncomfortable. And so I think if you want to, and this exists like everywhere, it's not just in like, completely like institutionalized things with a constitution or whatever, but like, but anyway, like, I guess the point is like, intervention is possible. Like you can change those things. You can change habits, you can change rules, you can change laws, but like, you can't just do it like because you decided, you woke up one day and you're like, I think it should be different. Like there needs, like you have to decide what things you want to change. You have to get allies. You have to like build a movement. You have to like figure out like exactly how you're going to go about it. And like, and if you think about it as like this like symbolic order that stretches through everything that you do, I think it's a healthy way to think about it. And in like this is like a static thing that helps us all have some ground like to stand on, that we can share a common reality, but it also can work against us too.
Thanks very much, Eric. Can everyone hear me? I guess I'll jump in now. I really like that etymological analysis that Sean did in terms of state having the same root as a static. And what I found in my research and my work and just watching the news is that it's kept that way largely because people in power, they can afford lobbyists, they can afford people who they can afford a human to work full time on keeping the system a certain way, making the system a certain way. There are even government agencies, for example, I litigate against the state bar, and they have they get busted every once in a while spending nearly $1 million at a time on lobbyists, right? This is the judiciary. They're hiring lobbyists, to make them keep it a certain way so that they can stay rich and not have to tell people about it. So I do think that it is very possible for the state to support CDP. It's I would say, funnily enough, the reason behind governments or basically 501c3s not being able to support legislation, it kind of makes sense, but it's also it's also kind of broad, right? I mean, we could always just improve that and change, like who pays taxes and how, right? And with respect to the 501c3, so that, right, so the state could support, different organizations, including CDP, so that, to benefit the next generation. But I think that where we are is that old money, big money, and large corporations, they're able to hire people full time, right, to keep the system or change the system in ways that benefits them and screws over the rest of us. So it is possible, but we do have to find ways to fight against that.
Can y'all hear me? Am I tapped in? I just kind of wanted to chip in on the same sort of perspective is that I think that one of the biggest challenges for autonomous and flat organization generally is that sort of thing. People from the outside, people within the existing order trying to suppress it. And if you look at the history of people trying to do stuff like this, that's very often what happens to them, is that they get taken down by outside people from the outside sponsoring their takedown. That's what happens to, most of the pre-state societies were fairly flat or completely flat organizations. And I think that historically, anthropologically, the origin of the state is in war, and in particular total war, marshaling resources as much as possible towards the maximum application of violent force. And I think that that's probably the thing that the state is very best at, just based on historical evidence alone. And also that it's probably one of the biggest challenges for a flat or non-hierarchical organization to meet and overcome, because it has been something that has eventually toppled even quite successful movements like the anarchists in the Spanish Civil War, and like a lot of other instances you can think of historically, either neolithically or just generally in terms of other cultures besides ours that are more flatly organized and don't use as many resources. And I think that, again, like, this is one of the major problems, not just in terms of how do we protect ourselves against people who want to benefit by hurting us, and also How do we do that without maximizing, without burning the candle at both ends, without using all of our resources for war, like the people who oppose cloud organizations are going to do. And I don't have a good answer to that. I would say that the Spanish anarchists are a good starting point, but they ultimately lost. So there's also that to take into consideration. How do we protect ourselves? I think of I forget the name of the archipelago, but there's an Indian archipelago that contains one of the last uncontacted tribes in the world. And the reason is that they violently reject contact every single time. Everybody that has ever tried to go to their islands has been killed. And I don't obviously advocate that level of extremism, but I do think it's worth noting that one of the few tribes that survived was the one that was really willing to completely just push away, that kind of influence strongly enough that they still have their own islands. So I do think that this is something
might not
that
work.
is a significant issue to deal with, how to keep people from using all the resources to attack you when you don't really want to use all of your resources to attack you. You'd rather use them to, help people. So I'll yield. Thank you.
Just a reminder that when you're in the middle, you don't have to raise your hand. You can just talk like you're at a bar.
Oh, I don't talk at bars. You might have noticed if you know me. I'll just dance. But what I want to say, I think the question of protection and that kind of stems from the idea that there's always going to be this us versus them. And I feel like one of the biggest questions and projects of building a world without the state or with a non-hierarchical state is how can we actually come to agreement and coordination and cooperation? How do we actually work together to protect resources and to prevent wild extraction and unnecessarily damaging the environment and things like that. And not just, there's an aspect of protection. There's also an aspect of how do we distribute resources, all these things. How do we regulate ourselves to create as much health as we can for ourselves and everyone. And I think that the question of how do we actually reach agreements and coordination and cooperation is, to me, the biggest question. Especially right now, we have things like social media algorithms that radicalize people and essentially brainwash people. It's an algorithm that's brainwashing people. And advertisements and what happened, I think, recently in our California propositions, where we didn't actually get to get more money for schools by changing the tax laws. That stuff seems like the only reason that didn't pass is because of some kind of brainwashing through advertisement. And I think that the ultimate answer to that is talking to people in person and building relationships and having conversations. And to me, that's CDP. That's the whole point of Community Democracy Project, is if we build structures for people to learn how to talk to each other and come to agreement, we can actually work through the part where there's an us and a them. I feel like a lot of these non-hierarchical structures that we want to see and the examples that we have come from people who have a shared goal, shared value system. And that shared goal and shared value system could be selling Gore-Tex, or it could be in Chiapas, it could be building a free society that's not oppressed by the state. But again, that shared goal happens when people talk to each other and meet face to face. And what I want to believe is that we can do that even with our conservative neighbors and whatever, all these people, because the shared goal really is mutual thriving in some sense. And I think, to me, the path forward, the way to make our way from what we have now to what we want in this, whether it's a non-hierarchical state or a not state, I feel like the thing we need is to learn how to talk to each other across differences and find those shared values so that we can build these things. And to me, that is exactly why I 100% all in on CDP, because I think that's the ultimate experiment. Can we can we do things with our neighbors who are strangers who we don't know? Can we find those shared goals to build what we want in our city? And if we can do it with our neighbors, that's a good first experiment, because that fits that 150 rule, that fits the it fits the like something I can imagine. Like I can imagine talking to all my neighbors, and I can't really imagine taking down the United States of America, but I can definitely imagine like figuring out how to make Oakland better for everyone who lives here.
Devo, you put the 150 back, and I kind of wanted to build on. I had another reason that I had jumped in, but I forget it now. But I'm sort of getting. I've got two ideas, and I don't know how to make them kind of work together. But yes, I've also read about the your social circle of 150, and that's about what we are capable of maintaining healthily. And this idea of global cooperation in a non-hierarchical way. How do we do those things at the same time? And how do we cooperate with each other in a way that defends against mass influence of propaganda and radicalizing algorithms? Like what are the mechanisms that we do so that the communities that we build are defended not just from outside powers, but from internal imbalances of power from collecting? Like how do we stopgap like defend the progress that we make? I guess I want to hear what people think about that.
I like what Devo was saying about having like Oakland as a trial run almost. I mean, I definitely see CDP spreading and doing this. And when Jonathan was talking, I was thinking about Rojava as like a current example where there was like relatively stateless or whatever, but then, Turkey comes in and genocides people. So like to have a stateless, like what would look stateless to us, I think comes with, like getting rid of borders, having international solidarity, which is a pretty big task. I don't know if we can do it in our lifetime, but like as long as there's borders, as long as there's multiple separate power things, then there'll be states that use violence against each other. So I think like international solidarity, however we get there, whether it's starting in Oakland and spreading out, or I don't know, maybe a new enlightenment or something, like some sort of shift that somehow gets us to a point where we can get like I don't know, when I read articles about Rojava, I feel solidarity with them, even though they're outside. I don't know if 150 is my limit, maybe 20, but they're well outside that. But
I bridge that 150 people who I know and know their mother and shared identity with billions of people that you've never met, and that's not an intuitive thing that we've evolved for. So like how do we get everybody in the world to agree on that?
And I don't know if we can do it in our lifetime, but it's I just liked what Diva said about starting in Oakland and seeing it spread. Yeah, as long as we have borders or constitutions or I don't know, whatever things that, like Sean was saying, things that are historical that you're born into that feel like they're, I'm paraphrasing, but holding you back or whatever, rather than like creating our own human projects. I don't know. I'll step out.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on, somebody asked, I think it might have been Emily, how we prevent environmental destruction without the state. And I think like we're all pointing to a lot of historical examples here because we recognize that like there was a time before capitalism, and capitalism, like though it is like long in our lifespans, it's like not, it hasn't been here forever. And, I would point to the commons as a way that prevented environmental destruction in most circumstances. I'm sure you can find exceptions to the rule, but I feel like the problem is less like how do we create organization that keeps people from like violating and degrading the environment, and more like how do we remove the current system of motives that incentivize those things to happen. Because I think people's natural state is to like not destroy the place that they live. So yeah. I'll tap out after that.
Yeah, just kind of based on the conversation that's happened and that we're kind of running out of time, just want to do like maybe a little shameless plug of like CDP has a school for organizing that we're trying to put together, which I think would be a great forum for having this conversation further, as well as kind of operationalizing maybe some of the ideas of experimenting with how do you, I guess, get coordination and cooperation in effect without the use of coercion. So if anyone is interested in joining our next cohort, either email CDP directly or drop your email in the chat, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation with anyone interested in trying this experiment in real time on a city level scale.
Awesome plug. And we are at time, but I'm going to leave the Zoom meeting open so y'all can keep chatting. I'll just stop recording, and I will also remove the spotlight so we can all see each other. And then what? You can practice not needing a leader by figuring out by yourselves when this is over. But thank you all for coming.